Thank you for joining us. Once again, my name is Dr. Dwayne Kwaysee Wright Barrington III. I am an assistant professor, as well as have the honor and privilege of serving as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives here at the Graduate School for Education and Human Development, which is part of the prestigious George Washington University, which is in the nation's capital. On behalf of our leadership, Dean Michael Foyer, our interim senior associate dean, Lionel Howard, our faculty whose research, teaching, and pedagogy inspires me every day, our staff who's the bread and butter of what we do here, and our students who are at a core of our mission, GSEHD welcomes you to our annual MLK lecture. The history of this event, folks, is quite a simple one. Way back in the winter of 2020, I actually gave a lecture about MLK performances and celebrations being performative. Why? Because as a troublemaker, I like to stir trouble. And then we walked into the summer of 2020. And the faculty at GSEHD decided that what we needed to do was first and foremost have a contribution to the larger GW's King Week, which is put on by our good friends at the Multicultural Student Services Center, which is part of an operation here of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. What we wanted to do was connect the King Week celebration to our research and teaching mission. And we decided to do that by honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King by highlighting the work of a junior scholar whose research agenda clearly and profoundly connects with Martin Luther King's legacy. Why did we decide to do that? Well, within the summer of 2020, the so-called racial reckoning, which is now almost 3 years away, believe it or not, what the GSEHD faculty recognized is that even though we were going through a moment, what we really needed was to try and ignite a movement. Why? Well, folks, moments have backlash. We have gone from where states had laws that prevented Black people from reading to now we have some states that are prohibiting all kids from reading about Black people. We have gone from our LGBTQ sisters and brothers' lives being criminalized out of existence to some states passing laws where in the classroom you can't even say the word gay. So instead of leaning on a moment, because moments are susceptible to backlash, what the faculty of GSEHD profoundly said is we needed to try to ignite a movement. And the MLK lecturer today, I think, is part of that movement. All right, so what is the theme of today? I said we need a movement, not a moment. And what movements are not passive, right? We'll hear throughout the next 2 weeks, the next couple of weeks over Black History Month, a lot of King quotes. So here's one that I'll give you. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And if I can be so bold to tell you today, racism repackaged and reformed as concepts that we have determined and evidence shows are both intellectually and theoretically bankrupt, such as colorblindness, will not drive out racism. We need something, if I dare say, rather affirmative. We need something that's rather active. We need something that bends the arc of the moral universe towards justice. We need something like anti-racism. So here is how the event will work today. I am going to introduce the event. I'm going to kick it off to my colleague to introduce the speaker. The speaker will give her research presentation. And folks, what this is a research presentation. It's premature because it hasn't been published yet, but it's a done presentation. We invite your comments, your critiques, and then a senior scholar will give a response. After the response, we have set aside some time for question and answer within the period. A few house rules. First, we are here as an intellectual community. You don't necessarily need to agree with everything that will be said. In fact, the whole purpose of the event is to invite critique to make the presentation and the project better before publication. As a private university, GSEHD reserves the right to kick anyone that's misbehaving out. We've never had to do that. I hope not to do that, but we welcome engagement. We welcome strong critique, but as my mother would say, you don't have to agree with everything that will go on here, but if you want to stay here, you best behave. All right, before I shut up and turn it over to the stars of the show, one final thing. It is not lost on me today that we are celebrating and commiserating with many Black women. It is perhaps ironic that over the next couple of weeks and the next couple of months, we will see one of the most striking examples of what Kimberly Crenshaw coined as intersectionality, as we, and rightfully so, celebrate the legacy of a Black man, Dr. Martin Luther King, today. We go into Black History Month and celebrate mostly Black men. And then we go into Women's History Month in March and celebrate mostly white women. So I want to take the time today to honor just a few Black women, both historical and working here with us at GW. First, Dorothy Hyatt, who was the former national president of the National Council of Negro Women and a former president of Delta Sigma Theta, which at least one of our presenters today is a member of. From Dorothy Hyatt, you get former Dean Mary Futrell, who was the former dean of GSEHD and one of our most prolific donors still here today. I want to highlight names like Diane Nash, who helped organize the Freedom Riders. And from Diane Nash, we get names like our own Dr. Jordan West, who is here today, I'm sure, I haven't looked at it, and is busy helping out to form our Diversity Summit, as well as make sure that the community here at GW moves a little bit closer to what Dr. King called the beloved community. Names like Ella Baker, the director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and from her we get names like our own Vice Provost of Student Affairs, Dean Colette Coleman, who works very hard every day to make sure that the space within GW is a hospitable one for all students. Names like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was the organizer of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And from her, you get people like our own Dean Dana Bowen Matthews, who was the dean of the GW Law School, and in her first couple of years here, founded the Equity Center. Names like Daisy Bates, who was the founder and really the impetus behind the Little Rock integration crisis of 1957, and who led the education project at the NAACP for many years. And from her, we get the outstanding Dr. Denise Dortch, an assistant professor here at GSEHD, who is working very hard to make sure that the psychological and physical violence that affects our Black students here today can finally get mitigated. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend, Dr. Dortch. Please enjoy the event.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. I'm excited to be here and to present today's speaker. I was actually last year's speaker for this wonderful event presenting on psychological violence in higher education spaces. And so it's quite apropos that I have the opportunity to be able to introduce you to our wonderful speaker today. Today we have Dr. Charmaine Connor, who is a licensed professional counselor and national certified counselor with experience providing mental health services to children, adolescents, and adults in a variety of settings, which include residential, private practice, and nonprofit agencies. She specializes in play therapy, servicing children who are transracially adopted, children who've experienced trauma, and children who've demonstrated academic and behavioral concerns. Her clinical experiences have afforded her with the knowledge and skills to provide diverse examples when teaching and supervising students. Dr. Connor was selected as a 2018-2019 doctoral fellow with the National Board for Certified Counselors Minority Fellowship Program. Her commitment to serving minoritized populations and infusing social justice practices to the counseling profession has continued through her scholarly publications, her presentations at professional conferences, and mentorship with former students and supervisees. Lastly, I would be remiss if I did not say that sort of the wind beneath her wings, the people that fuel her work and her scholarship are her nephew, Rashawn White, who is the apple of her eye, and her mother, who is also attending at this event. So I'd like to present to you now Dr. Charmaine Connor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that amazing introduction, Dr. Dortch. It is my pleasure to be here to speak to each and every one of you about my research. I hesitate to call it my research because that's not only what it is, that's not only the role that it has in my life. I believe that this is a part of my life work in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And so I'm really excited to be here, and I welcome your presence. I welcome your questions when the time calls for it, and I welcome your overall attention. And so I hope that you are able to really sit with the information and digest it in a way in which you can take what's being shared here today further and make it your own. So I'm going to give my screen a share. I have a little bit of an advanced tech situation going on here, so give me a brief moment to get everything set up. All right. Everyone should be able to see the PowerPoint on their screen. So I'm going to be talking to you all today about my research that's currently in progress called Moving Towards Anti-Racism, a Group Process. And I want to speak to where this research originally came from. This came from the current socio-political climate. It was birthed out of the protests that happened across our nation and even across the globe in 2020 through 2021. And because of those protests, I heard a lot of conversations happening from my students in my personal life, with friends, with family members about, well, what does it mean to be anti-racist? And people not really knowing what it means. And for those who did know, being very passionate and fired up about the topic, but also people that weren't really being emphasized, or their voices weren't being really emphasized on social media, were the ones that didn't really know, or either they were being shamed for being ignorant about anti-racism altogether and what it means to engage in anti-racist practices. And so I wanted to take it upon myself to combine some of my interests, which were related to group work. I believe in the power of group therapy and being able to have those interpersonal connections happen so that people can see how they show up with others and get feedback on it. And I figured, hey, why can't we put that with moving towards anti-racism, helping people to really get to the core of any biases or prejudices or discriminatory practices that they uphold, to be challenged in how they navigate their everyday personal and professional life. And that's what birthed this research project overall. So after quite a bit of time and consideration, consultation with my own mentors, I was told, you know, you might want to save that for after you have tenure. And for me, I said, well, what is tenure if I'm not doing the things that I'm passionate about and moving the needle forward? And I don't want that to ever be dangled in front of me as a carrot to prevent me from breaking down the barriers, particularly around multicultural and social justice issues in the counseling profession, but in the world at large. So I took a risk and decided to do this research anyway. So this was the purpose of the group. I wanted to see if participating in a group process would increase the group members' knowledge regarding anti-racist counseling practices. I also wanted to understand whether or not participating in this group process would help the group members to identify any biases and areas of growth related to racism. And then the last purpose of this group was for the members to commit to engaging in critical consciousness, to help them move forward towards anti-racism in their personal and professional lives. And so those were the three main goals of the group, the overall purpose of the group, and that contributed to how the group was structured. So starting out, here is what we knew. This is what we found in the literature. We found that so far, Kendi, Patrice, and Roosevelt et al., they all define anti-racism as the practice of acknowledging the effects of racism and taking action against racist practices. And that's what I also saw anecdotally on social media, heard from different students, different family members, and some people had no definition altogether. And other people didn't know what to do with this information. So there was a definition in some journals that gave us some insight into how anti-racism was being defined. It was a lot of verbiage in the news coverage over the period of 2020 through 2021. And yet still people felt unsettled. And as Dr. Wright shared, there are people who are so afraid of this word anti-racist or anti-racism that there are people who are trying to eradicate any information or resources about how to engage in anti-racist practices from school settings for young children. And then what we also found out, or what we knew when we reviewed the literature, is that this term was introduced in the counseling profession in the early 2000s. And so people started to use it. It became a little bit more popular, not as popular as some of the other terms related to intersectionality, diversity, equity, inclusion, and things of that sort. But it did gain some traction in the early 2000s. And yet, and still, there isn't much literature about how to incorporate this in counselor education programs and how to incorporate anti-racism into the counseling profession altogether. And so what I mean by that is, what does this mean for our students? What does this mean for what we are training them to do? I don't know about anyone else's training mantra, but I know about my own. And I tell my students every semester when I encounter them, I am training you to be an equitable and effective counselor. And so taking my own philosophy about what my training mantra was, I noticed that there were gaps in the literature about how do I prepare these counselors in training to go out and attend to issues related to racism when they have clients that come in that may experience racist events, or when they have clients that may come in and say, hey, I've been hearing about this and I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what this looks like. How do I move towards being anti-racist? How do I eradicate racism from my life? How do I decolonize my thinking, my feelings, and my practices? And that's what our literature had a gap in, and I wanted to be able to do some research to fulfill that gap. So this is what we wanted to know. This was our only research question. What are the experiences of counselor education students participating in an experiential process group focused on facilitating movement towards anti-racism? So I want to break that down just a little bit more. We wanted to know about counselor education students' experiences, those specific experiences of them participating in what we're calling an experiential, or what you'll later hear is expressive arts process group. And for those of you all who are not connected to mental health or are curious about what a process group is, a process group is an opportunity for individuals to come together and process about a topic. We also use the term psychoeducational group, and that's where we maybe teach something to folks. But this group was intended to be process oriented for people to come through and express their internal thoughts and feelings about the topic at hand, which happened to be anti-racism. And I wanted to know, would these experiences help make movement towards anti-racism overall? So here's what we did. We did what's called a transcendental phenomenological study. This is the type of study that we use when we want to understand the immediate experience, or I should say type of research method we use when we want to understand the immediate experience of a participant. It gives us rich insight into what a person may have been thinking, feeling, what their overall experience was over a period of time, one moment in time. This also allows for a small sample size. So yes, I hope that one day this will be able to be a quantitative study that can have so many people be a part of it, hundreds of folks. I'm fine with that, but I'm also fine with doing the foundational work right now and being able to have this small sample size to give us insight into what our counselor education students experience throughout this group process will set up the foundation for future quantitative-based studies around this work. And so it all comes together full circle. We need both quantitative and qualitative research to inform one another. I'm going to spend some time here and talk about my research team. So I'm very honored to be here presenting by myself, but I want to make sure that I give credit to everyone who has helped and give their contributions to this project. I'm the primary investigator, the lead investigator for this study, and my role has been to oversee every part of the study, from the construction of the interview protocol, as well as selecting the people to be the group facilitators, helping out with the coding analysis. I facilitated qualitative interviews, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But I facilitated qualitative interviews. I oversaw the project as a whole, and I'm also actively involved in the current data analysis process. And I have a student research team, and that research team is involved of several people who helped to facilitate the pre and post qualitative interviews. So qualitative interview is essentially an opportunity for, or at least in this study, an opportunity for an interviewer to ask the participants in the study some semi-structured questions. And we'll talk about the interview protocol a little bit later as well. And so they asked them questions. These interviews lasted about 45 to 90 minutes, depending on the range of the participant. Some participants had a lot to say, and some participants did not have a lot to say. And a lot of them even reported off script that they felt intimidated being asked these questions because no one had ever asked them before. I also have two students. They are master's students who are serving on the coding team, and they are helping out with the coding process. It has been a learning experience for them. They are getting a lot of understanding of what research entails. I also teach the research course. So oftentimes I get feedback that I thought research was only crunching numbers. And I always tell them, yeah, that takes about 10 minutes of the process. There's so much more that goes into the research process beyond the equation. So it's been a pleasure to have these two students on the coding team. One of them holds a racially diverse identity. They identify as Punjabi South Asian, and then the other person identifies as a white person. And they also wanted me to include that they have a strong commitment towards multicultural and social justice issues within our profession. And they were selected intentionally. The coding team was selected so that we could check each other's biases. We wanted to maintain objectivity within the coding process. And so by having myself as a racially diverse person who also understands research, or at least qualitative research, and then having two students, one who identifies as South Asian and the other as white, racially we could triangulate and call each other's biases and blind spots into question when needed. And that has happened over the course of our time together. And I have learned something myself. They have learned something. I've had to really work through the power dynamic, mainly because they see me as their instructor and as their professor. And I'm seeing them as these are going to be my future colleagues someday, as soon as they graduate in May. And so that's been a few of the challenges that we've experienced within the coding team. But we have each and every time taken a hard stop and really worked through what was happening racially for us based on what was coming up in the data, engaging in that epoche process, which is where we talk about what is contributing to our immediate experience when we are reading the transcripts. And then our group facilitators. These were 4 master's level internship students. They had racially diverse identities. 2 of them were white, 2 of them were Latinx identities. as far as race goes, and they were selected based on their clinical skills. So it was very important to me, it was more important to me, I would say, that I had someone who had strong clinical skills to be able to facilitate these groups so that should charged conversations occur, they would have the maturity level and developmental wherewithal to be able to handle those things in the moment, and they wouldn't feel frazzled or overwhelmed with what do I do next. And so this is why the internship students were selected. So that is our research team. So I bet you're wondering, after all that I have shared, can you trust the data? I've been involved in the qualitative interviewing process. I'm helping out with the coding analysis process. This has been work that has master's students contributing their time, knowledge, and skill level. And there are 4 ways that we have attempted to ensure trustworthiness throughout our study. And one is through peer debriefing, making sure that we give space for people to speak to what's happening for them throughout this process that has happened verbally and written wise. They've been able to take notes and have a journal to write out their thoughts and express what's happening for them internally. And this helps to increase the ethical validation of our study. When we do the final write-up, we will be engaging in thick description, meaning that this is going to contribute to the overall transferability of the study, meaning someone else could go out and replicate this, as well as enhance the credibility of the data overall. I'll be using the feedback from Dr. Pittman today in our thick description when I write this study up for the manuscript publication, because this is a part of the research process as well, and one of the favorite things I like about phenomenology. The next area that we try to use to promote overall trustworthiness is our independent coding process. You heard me speak to, there are 3 of us who are on the coding team. We have printed out the transcripts of the recordings of the interviews that you heard me speak about. And within those transcripts, we are looking at that data alone. And when we look at that data alone, we're writing out in the margins the things that come up for us. And then we have structured coding team meetings weekly where we then look at the data all together, and we're able to compare notes and say, well, here's what I thought was going on. And someone else might say, well, I thought that this was going on. And we talk about the nuances and the differences in what we saw based on who we are and what we read and how we understand things. Through doing independent coding, this helps to promote credibility and the overall dependability of the data. You're able to say, this isn't something that is being relied upon one person's perspective. It's being relied upon 3 people's consensus. And then the last area in which we have attempted to ensure some trust is through what we call an audit trail. I have a hard drive that has every single thing, every email, every text message screenshot, every document related to this study. It is all put away on a hard drive, and it's available to anyone to say, hey, I want to check and see if you did exactly what you said you were going to do. And by doing this, this provides overall coherence. It makes the study make sense and furthers the credibility of the data overall, so that when you see this in publication, you know, okay, they did what they needed to do, and we can mostly trust this data. All right. I'll get into some of the eligibility criteria for the group members. We had 3 main criteria that each member had to meet. They needed to be a counseling student in a K-CREP counselor education program in the United States. This was a designation that was made by, the Institutional Review Board at my institution. And if you have ever had to write an IRB application, you just don't fight with the IRB unless it's worth it. You gotta pick your battles. And it didn't matter to me as much to fight them so hard on this when I wanted to make sure they were going to allow me to do the study all together. Because in the same ways that society at large was struggling with these supercharged conversations around anti-racism, so have institutions been struggling with things that they will approve, how they're wanting to communicate certain messages, how this would be received by the different students, how a flyer would be received by the general student body or our program at large. And so I didn't fight them on them saying it had to be K-CREP. I was fine with that. But I did want to make sure that everyone was at least 18 years of age. Anyone who is a counseling student in our program who has to be 18 years of age. So that was okay. That wasn't hard to get recruitment for. And then they had to complete at least one semester in a K-CREP accredited counselor education program. So initially when this study was promoted, it was promoted to any student in a K-CREP accredited counselor education program. But because of the timing of the study, it initially happening during the summertime, we didn't get much traction. And then I decided to pivot and see if our social and cultural foundations professor would allow me to use class period or class time during his class period to facilitate this group, because he was already making his students participate in a process group. And so it ended up being what we call sample of convenience. These participants were conveniently available to me. So this is how I got our eligible participants for the study. And now we'll get into the step-by-step process. So the study went through Institutional Review Board approval, or IRB approval, where they let me know that I could move forward with recruiting and engaging in the study. I recruited for the study in the summer initially. That would have been summer 2021. And that's when we realized that recruitment would be scarce and that we wouldn't get much participation. And so we went back to the drawing board, did some modifications, and decided to start in spring 2021. And so then we sought informed consent. I'm sorry, excuse me, my date was wrong. That would have been summer 2021, spring 2022. So then we sought out informed consent. We got the students to consent to being a part of the study. Every student who was a part of the Social and Cultural Foundations course was required to participate in the group per their instructor's course requirements. The participants who are in the study are the people who consented to us doing an interview about their overall experience, a pre and post interview. So we did a pre and post intervention interview, which is qualitative interview, for 45 to 90 minutes with each of the participants. The participants met for 10 weekly 1-hour group process sessions. These 1-hour group process sessions, the time was set by the instructor. Ideally, in the future, I would like for these to be 1.5 to 2 hours, but because of the course requirement, they were set to 1 hour. The students were instructed to read So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluhu. And within those readings, they were supposed to sit with the information and come prepared to engage in an expressive arts activity during the next group session. And so each week there was an expressive arts activity that was created to take the reading content deeper and to further their self-awareness, as well as generate discussion and overall conversation about what they read and how they felt about it. After the study, or after the intervention was completed, we then engaged in the adapted phenomenological data analysis model. In other words, coding, which is where we are right now. And the coding team and I are reviewing the transcripts and in the process of putting together a coding book so that we can go back and establish the themes that we have seen come out of the data and put that into publication. All right. So here's what our interview protocol looked like. I want to take a moment to explain that this interview protocol is for the pre-interview. We asked the same questions in the post-interview, but we changed the tense for grammar purposes. So any question that you read that may seem different for post, that's why. It wouldn't be communicated in the pre-tense because the intervention had already occurred. So for example, question number seven, what do you hope to gain from this group experience? On the post-interview protocol, the question was, what did you gain from this group experience? So I'm going to give you all an opportunity to take a moment and read through those questions before I move on. All right. So moving on, I want to spend a little time here talking about what the week-to-week snapshot looked like. So they were reading through the different chapters of the book, and I've included some examples of the titles of the expressive arts activities that they, moved through based on those chapter readings. In week one, they didn't have to come having read anything. This was an opportunity for them to introduce themselves. So they participated in an activity where they introduced themselves saying, I am, and I show up in the world as. And the purpose of that activity was to have them share who they are, share what comes up to the forefront for them when they think about how they show up in the world, and generate what that may mean about navigating through this group. So I'll share with you an example of what it would look like if I were to introduce myself. I would say, I am Charmaine Connor, and I show up in the world as a Black auntie. The reason why I say that is because those are my most salient identities. Any and everything that I do, I'm very aware that I'm a Black woman and very well that I am Rayshawn's auntie. And so that's why I chose to introduce myself in that way. People can introduce themselves based on their interests, identities that they hold, or even different roles that they may have within their professional or personal life. So I would like to know, is there anyone in the audience who'd be willing to give this a try and share what their name is and how they show up in the world? Are there any volunteers?
So if no one else is going to volunteer.
I
no,
was
go
going to say
ahead.
I'll volunteer.
Go ahead.
I show up in the world as associate professor of counseling and a proud grandmother of 2 extraordinary grandchildren.
Thank you, Dr. Reese. So if you were in the group, everyone would go around and say that, and the facilitator would then open up discussion for why might I have asked you to introduce yourself in that way? How might that contribute to our time together in this group? What does this mean about the intersection of identities that we have here? And there would be a conversation about intersectionality later throughout the group curriculum, but getting that conversation started now, being able to ground people into what they have in store over the next 9 weeks, helping them to understand that this is going to require some work, require some vulnerability, and require some respect. And so having an understanding of each and every one of the people's identities can help build rapport on the front end. So that was week 1. Thank you, Dr. Reese. So then week 4 was person in the environment. So this is during this week, they were asked to reflect upon a time when they either witnessed or heard about an experience of racism, or even encountered an experience of racism themselves. And then they were to create using clay or Play-Doh, that's what we could afford at the time, but using Play-Doh to create what did that person in that environment need from those around them to feel safe. And the purpose of that expressive arts activity was to get into the internal reflection space for them, to help them to understand that these are people who are actually experiencing these events, and what did they need, and can you articulate how you might have shown up for them had you been there, or shown up for yourself if you could. Week 8 is moving towards anti-racism, the bridge. The bridge is an expressive arts activity that helps people to reflect on the past, present, and future of where they are related to any particular topic. This activity was selected for week 8 because from a counseling perspective, we're going into the termination phase now. And so we want the group members to be reflecting on what did they think about anti-racism, either when they started this group or before they started this group. Where do they feel they are right now, and where do they see themselves going in the future? And then they would create a bridge across the sheet of paper and write down phrases or draw pictures that would connect them from where did they come from and how did they get to the present. So what contributed to that? And what do they need to go from where they are right now to get to the future in their progress towards engaging in anti-racist practices? And then week 10 was termination and debrief. And this was an opportunity for them to discuss what does it mean for the group to be over? How does this work look like beyond our group process together? So who was there? There were 23 participants between the age ranges of 23 and 50 years old. All members of all racial groups were represented throughout these groups. There were 4 groups of 10 people because of the class size, but 23 of those 40 folks, or 36 to 40 folks, decided to participate in the study. We had cisgender and non-binary gender representation. We also made sure that all of the students were enrolled in our social and cultural foundations, also known as the multicultural counseling course for our students. And every student resided in the Chicagoland area, which means that they lived in Chicago city limits or within the surrounding suburbs. So here is what we are learning based upon the preliminary findings, and it is important for me to emphasize the word preliminary. We are still in the coding process, in the data analysis process, so that means that this could change once we have looked at all of the data comprehensively. We're resuming our coding team meetings next week, and we'll be finished coding by the end of this semester. But so far, what we have learned are 3 things keep coming up over and over. And what we are seeing is that this definition of anti-racism is something that people are speaking to in a very rich way. In each of these quotes that you're going to see on the next 3 slides, this is the same person talking related to that theme. There are 3 different people, but what is said in the pre-interview and what was in the post-interview, those quotes are from the same person. So in the pre-interview, one person said, I would say working towards treating everyone equally, not having any prejudices against other people based on the color of their skin or where they're from. So actively working towards being less prejudiced. That was their definition of anti-racism. And if you remember from the interview protocol, we asked them to define anti-racism. That's what they said in the pre-interview before the intervention. So after the group had occurred, their definition of anti-racism is like you have to maintain an anti-racist ideology and understanding where what the history of it is and what like the context of it is in general. And then the understanding how that has had effects throughout history, and then how that has contemporary effects and how you can make changes in your behavior, and then also participate in like local organization and continuing education to sort of make this big like landscape of anti-racist action. The second theme that we have seen and what we are learning in our preliminary findings is that in the pre-interview related to group expectations, someone shared, I think I'm hoping to learn how to be anti-racist, more like gain more knowledge on it so that I can kind of pass that on in my professional and personal life. At the post-interview, the same person has shared, I feel like these kinds of talks can easily turn into an argument and sometimes just not have a proactive conversation with people. And there was definitely a space where I felt like we could just be honest and not feel judged for what we would say or something. And then our third theme, for what we're learning in their preliminary themes related to addressing racism. In the pre-interview, this participant said, I don't ever want to react in any angry manner or in a manner that someone else would find even though, again, I'm not the one who was at fault at first, in a way that someone would find to be disrespectful and minimize basically what happened. If you can't tell, this population of students really like to use the word like. In the post-interview, the same participant said, I feel even more comfortable now because back then, I think that I didn't know how to approach something, but now I definitely feel I have at least more knowledge. And just having these conversations with people in my group and being at the university is redacted, I feel I learned so much just in general about how to acknowledge it and how to address it. So based upon these preliminary things and the quotes that we have come across and in our overall discussions about the data, here are some preliminary implications or things to consider. One thing that's very clear to us is that the term anti-racism is not fully understood. And I hope that that changes in the near future, specifically for our counseling students. When I think about the profession that I have the most area of knowledge and skill in, I want our counselors in training to truly be prepared to understand what it means to engage in anti-racist counseling practices. And not fully understanding the definition will convolute what those practices look like. It is my understanding that two of my esteemed colleagues are conducting a Delphi study through the ACES interest network to get a definition of anti-racism available for us in counselor education. And I hope that their efforts with that research will inform my own research to help to make sure that I am putting forth information that will contribute to anti-racist practices for the counseling profession and society at large. Another preliminary thing to consider is that process groups focused on addressing racism may be beneficial. Again, I go back to the point that Dr. Wright made earlier about people being so fearful about the concept of anti-racism. And typically what I've come to understand is that people are fearful about the removal of certain powers and privileges that are associated with treating people equitably. But what I've learned from what we have experienced related to this data, these group participants, these students, I still have contact with these students because they're my students at my university, is that they want to know. They want to know how to engage in anti-racist practices. They want to know how to not be harmful. And it's important that they can have a space to really address those concerns. Something that we are also seeing in the data that has come across a few participants' transcripts, but not everyone so far, is that the need for affinity groups specifically for race, which I already know that, I agree with that, but also there's been a call for there to continue to be mixed groups. So I'm interested to see, or mixed racial groups. I'm interested to see where that data takes us and what comes out of future transcripts that we're looking at. And then the last preliminary thing to consider is that people want tangible ways to address racist encounters. And I do believe that it is going to be our responsibility as educators, trainers, supervisors to ensure that they get some tangible ways to do that, along with deepening their self-awareness so that they will do no harm to their future clients. So our next steps involve completing the data analysis process, submitting this research for a manuscript submission to a counseling journal, engaging in more presentations to spread the word. I'm really big on making sure that the general public gets information that we are hoarding in some of our counseling journals, and to engage in more future research and practice on incorporating anti-racism in the counseling profession. And with that being said, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Ooh, thank you, Dr. Connor. Oh man, that was a researcher's research presentation. Gosh, I am so glad we have some students here because you just saw an excellent presentation of how you produce knowledge, how you show the methodology. It's replicable, it's critiquable, and it's on an important subject. Thank you, Dr. Connor. We are blessed to have that word that you just put down on us. And now we will go to the response. And to the audience, the way this works is the junior faculty member gives the presentation and we get a senior faculty member to respond. The response is both a critique and a celebration of the junior faculty's members' work. And to respond today, we have a good one. Dr. Delishia Pittman is an associate professor of counseling in the Department of Counseling and Human Development right here at GW, the George Washington University. Dr. Pittman's research centers on racial and ethnic disparities in health behaviors and outcomes. Areas of particular emphasis include substance abuse, coping behavior, and stress, both chronic and traumatic, with the intent to further the understanding of how these factors independently and collectively affect behavioral outcomes among African Americans. She employs life course epidemiological frameworks to study the behavioral and psychosocial process that link adult health and disease risks to physical or social exposure during adulthood. Dr. Pittman's current projects extends this work to a focus on sexual health vulnerabilities, including STI and HIV infection behaviors in heterosexual Black women. This project seeks to model the complex relationships between socio, psycho, and cultural contexts and factors in STI and HIV infection risk among Black college women. Prior to joining the faculty here at GSEHD, Dr. Pittman worked as an assistant professor of counseling psychology at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. In addition, Dr. Pittman is a practicing licensed psychologist in the District of Columbia. In addition, she is the chair of our DEI Standing Committee. In addition, she is a member of the GW Faculty Senate. And fellas, word on the street is she has a better jump shot than all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce my friend, my colleague, Wonder Woman incarnate, Dr. Delishia Pittman. Thank you. We await your response.
Thank you for a most kind introduction, Dr. Wright. Unfortunately, the word on the street is debatable. It's been a many a year since I've touched a basketball, but nonetheless, I am so pleased to serve as a respondent to Dr. Connor's brilliant lecture. Before I get into the substance of the comments that I have, I do want to extend my gratitude and congratulations to Dr. Connor on this important work and for being selected to deliver this year's GSEHD MLK lecture. And I want to ask everyone, please join me again in a virtual round of applause for her fantastic presentation on this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well done. I also want to acknowledge the indigenous residents of the Piscataway and Anacostia peoples who continue to reside in this region, and of the land that the GW Foggy Bottom campus occupies. We also cannot separate the history of the university from the history of colonialism and slavery in the United States. And I want to acknowledge the legacy of slavery in this area and the work, sacrifice, and legacies of enslaved people on the culture and development of the communities in the DC surrounding areas. I will make my comments brief, as I'm sure I joined others in my desire to get to the Q&A component of tonight's lecture. So my comments are simply intended to underscore the important discussion Dr. Connors has invited us all into as we think about moving beyond performative anti-racism into embodied anti-racist training and practice. Suffice it to say, we know that racism is endemic in societies. It is systemic, pervasive, and persistent in all aspects of society and the lived experiences of people of color. Research has shown that the main reason for the lack of access to care are associated with discriminatory and racist attitudes and practices of helping professionals. Anti-racist education represents a critical task for educators and learners alike to equip themselves with transformative action, awareness, and knowledge and skills to eradicate racism and mitigate its impacts, past, present, and future. In their self-study, Ivy and colleagues ask us to consider whether or not we engage in education and training in a manner that helps develop anti-racist professional counselors, school counselors, supervisors, and counselor educators, especially given counselor education's existence is and has historically been overwhelmingly white and Eurocentric. Even today, nearly 62% of counselors identify as non-Hispanic white, and less than 20% identify as Black. Similarly, several scholars have called for action against anti-Black racism and white supremacy in the academy. More recently, in their introduction to the special issue Anti-Racist Counselor Education in the Teaching and Supervision Counseling Journal, Paul Harris and colleagues assert that it is critical for counselor education programs to move from only being aware of how racism operates to infusing anti-racism themes throughout all their pre and in-service training to ensure that graduates are well prepared to serve the unique post-traumatic needs of so many who continue to endure racism at every turn. And to that end, and as Kendi notes in his work, one is either racist or actively working toward being anti-racist, in that you are either actively upholding racism or actively disrupting and dismantling racist systems that pervade our society. As academics and counselor educators, we operate in systems that notably perpetuate systemic racism. And consequently, as counselor educators, we then likely train counselors who might work, live, and play in similarly oppressive systems. And thereby, we have a responsibility to the profession and to the public to be preparing future counselors to serve as disruptors and agitators in systems that are oppressive. And so while counselors have the potential to support and promote racial healing, justice, and equity, they also have the capacity and power to perpetuate racism, white supremacy, and cultural destruction. Here, I think it's also important to note that white supremacy and the perpetuation of white supremacist ideologies do not need white faces to work, underscoring that we all have a role to play in the development of anti-racist awareness and practice in our respective fields and the students that we prepare to lead and transform them. Even in its subscription to the postmodern tradition, academia and counselor education more pointedly can uphold and perpetuate racism unintentionally by those who are well-intentioned. As my good friend and colleague, Annalise Singh notes, the process of colonization has had a major impact in many institutional structures, including the counseling profession, leading to resistance to multicultural and social justice competencies. Even when we look at our KCREP standards and our counseling competencies, race is subsumed under the label of multiculturalism, which allows programs then to avoid pointed and direct conversations around race, racism, and the continued and furthering oppression and marginalization of BIPOC students in their programs and in the communities in which they serve. Counselors who fail to be trained in critical race discourse, social and commercial determinants of health and resultant health disparities, and critical whiteness studies, and thus then not trained to critically engage and dismantle oppressive symptoms and systems and practices, increase their risk of doing harm to the individuals and communities that they serve. Dr. Connor's work is timely, as there has been a surge in anti-racist scholarship in counseling and counselor education following the public 8-minute and 46-second execution of George Floyd. In my full support and efforts to help Dr. Connor strengthen her work, I will offer a few critiques, small, but I think they are food for thought, if you will, for you, Dr. Connor. The interview protocol that you shared with us invites participants to rate their comfort incorporating anti-racist practice in their personal and professional lives. Yet what you shared with us does not appear to have an assessment of any current or historical engagement in anti-racist practice and or sort of a definition of what those anti-racist practices might look like and how a curriculum like yours might help to deepen those practices. So while there is a definition and a probe to ask them to define anti-racism, anti-racist practice separately from anti-racism and defining anti-racism, I think could be further distinguished in future iterations of your work, both to underscore that curriculums like this are necessary for and helpful in building insight and awareness, and for those who may come to the table with some insight and awareness, how do we then deepen their commitment to this work and deepen their engagement in anti-racist practice? That said, one of the things I often say to my students, right, is that awareness is a prerequisite for change, but awareness is not always a precursor to change, right? Just because we know better doesn't mean we always do better. And so if we want to not only increase students' insight and awareness about anti-racist practice, their own biases, racism and structural racism, individual racism, but we want them to be agitators and disruptors and to feel empowered to do that. How do we utilize curriculums like this to facilitate that movement? Similarly, one of the identified purposes of this group was to increase participant knowledge of anti-racist counseling practice. But there isn't an actual discussion anywhere that I saw in the curriculum of a discussion around anti-racist counseling practice. Again, while there's attention given to ways to incorporate anti-racist actions in their personal and professional lives, a more pointed exploration of what that looks like then in the counseling space on behalf of individuals, I think is particularly necessary to advance work and meeting that particular purpose, the first purpose of this study. And I will draw your attention to, if you aren't familiar with Hipólito Delgado and Reinder's work, they assert that an anti-racist counseling identity is marked by addressing issues of oppression via social change to improve client well-being, and that counselors with an anti-racist identity and counseling approach also employ race-based competencies to explore the systemic roots of racism and its impacts on BIPOC clients. And I want to challenge you to think about in the curriculum presenting that definition of anti-racist counseling practice to counselor trainees as a model for where we are trying to move them to, but also to give them language to march alongside their counselor identity about what that work looks like, and what that work calls them to do. One of the things I often hear from my students is that social justice work is exhausting. And it is. And I tell them it is 24-hour a day, 7-day a week work. And if you are not exhausted, you are probably not working very hard, because folks who live in brown and Black skin, folks who live at the margins of society are exhausted. We are exhausted all day, every day. And we have learned to manage that exhaustion, and we carry it, and it is heavy, and we make it look easy. But if you are working to disrupt and dismantle systems, you should be tired. Systems are not built for individuals to dismantle. They are inherently built to be impervious to the individual's efforts. And so it will require a tremendous commitment on behalf of the individual to disrupt and agitate and dismantle those systems. My last comment is particularly pertains to the use of peers as group facilitators. One is a measurement concern. I will own my bias. I am trained as a quantitative methodologist, and I have a minor in quantitative statistics in my doctoral program, but I also have a certificate in mixed methodologies. So I value qualitative work tremendously, and I think this is important work and lends itself to qualitative inquiry well. But I am curious the impact that using peers as group facilitators have on the space that's created for students in the 10-week groups, and how that might be different if you were to use non-peers and or more experienced facilitators in that space. But also, to what degree are those students, I know you shared that the facilitators have been identified as students who were excelling on their internship and had demonstrated some commitment to this work. I still want to ensure that we are preparing students and guiding students from a place that is informed, that is from a place that is engaged, as well as from a place that is safe for them to take risk and to ask questions that they might not otherwise ask. And so my concern about the group facilitators is, are they equipped to prepare peers to do this work and build an anti-racist professional counseling identity in ways that will prepare them for this work going forward. Those are my comments at this point for your work. Again, I thank you for this work, for your commitment to this work and stepping out there and doing this work, which pre-tenure, which I know can be a risk for sure, to find that folks value the contributions that you are making. And I assure you that this is important work. And when you need a external reviewer, please, by all means, do include my name on your external reviewer list. I would be honored to serve as an external reviewer for your tenure and promotion process. Kudos.
All right, all right, all right. Thank you for that. Some profound words from Dr. Delishia Pittman. You know, whoever said that anti-racism was anti-intellectual clearly was not present here with us today on January 19, 2023, because you just heard from two stellar intellectuals. And I thank both of you for your time and for the gift of your knowledge. Folks, we're going to stop the recording now, and we're going to turn to questions and comments.